I thought I knew my husband of 15 years until the day he walked into divorce court with a smirk and a briefcase full of lies, demanding half of everything I'd built from nothing. What he didn't know was that I had an envelope in my purse that would change everything. My name is Mary, and 6 months ago I was sitting in the parking lot of the Riverside County Courthouse in California, my hands shaking as I watched Marcus stride confidently up the steps with his attorney. We were about to divide our assets, and he was convinced he'd walk away with half of my consulting business that I'd grown from my kitchen table into a 7-figure company. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same man who used to roll his eyes when I worked late into the night was now claiming he deserved half of what those late nights had built. It started like so many marriages do, with genuine love and shared dreams. We met at a coffee shop in Pasadena in 2008, both of us fresh out of college and drowning in student loans. Marcus was charming, funny, and had this way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room. He was working entry-level at a marketing firm, and I was temping at different offices while trying to figure out my next move. We moved in together after 8 months, got married 2 years later in a small ceremony at my parents' house in Phoenix, and I genuinely believed we were building something beautiful together. The first few years were good. We were both struggling financially, but we were struggling together. I remember countless nights eating ramen noodles and dreaming about the future, making lists of places we wanted to travel and goals we wanted to achieve. Marcus was supportive when I decided to go back to school for my MBA, even though it meant tighter budgets and me being even busier. He'd bring me coffee while I studied at our tiny kitchen table, and he'd joke that he was investing in our future CEO. In 2015, I started my consulting business from that same kitchen table. It was just me, a laptop, and a dream to help small businesses streamline their operations. Marcus was genuinely excited at first. He'd brag to his friends about his entrepreneur wife, and he'd help me practice presentations in our living room. But as the business started actually succeeding, something shifted. The support turned into subtle undermining. He'd make comments about how I was always working, or how I was becoming obsessed with money. When I landed my first 6-figure contract in 2018, instead of celebrating, he said, "I hope this doesn't change you." By 2020, my business was thriving even during the pandemic, while Marcus had been laid off from his marketing job. Instead of seeing this as an opportunity for us to weather the storm together, he became resentful. He'd make passive-aggressive comments about being a kept man and would guilt me for working long hours. When I suggested he could help with the business or take some online courses, he'd snap that not everyone could be as naturally gifted as I was. The man who once brought me coffee while I studied was now making me feel guilty for my success. The real breaking point came in early 2023. I discovered Marcus had been having an affair with a coworker from his new job at a different marketing firm. Not just any affair, but one where he was apparently telling this woman all about how unhappy he was and how his wife cared more about money than their marriage. I found out through a series of text messages I saw when he left his phone on the kitchen counter. Messages where he called me cold and money-obsessed and talked about how he couldn't wait to be free. When I confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he went on the attack. He told me that I had become someone he didn't recognize, that I cared more about my business than our marriage, and that he'd been emotionally abandoned for years. He made it sound like the affair was somehow my fault because I worked too much. The gaslighting was masterful, and for a moment I almost believed him. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said, "Don't worry, Mary, you'll be fine financially. We both know you're good at making money." The way he said it, with that smug little smile, made me realize this wasn't just about the affair. This was calculated. He was already thinking about the divorce settlement. The divorce proceedings started in April 2023, and that's when Marcus truly showed his colors. His attorney argued that because we'd been married for over a decade, and because Marcus had provided emotional support during the building of my business, he was entitled to half of everything. They claimed that his sacrifices and contributions to the household had enabled my success. The most infuriating part was how they twisted every kind gesture he'd made during our marriage into evidence of his investment in my business. His lawyer painted a picture of Marcus as the supportive husband who gave up career opportunities to support my dreams, who managed the household while I focused on work, who was an integral part of my business success even though he'd never officially worked for the company. They had documentation of times he'd answered my business phone when I was unavailable, emails where he'd helped coordinate my schedule, and even photos of him at networking events as my plus one. On paper, it looked like he'd been my business partner all along. What made it worse was how convincing Marcus was in his depositions. He'd always been charismatic, and now he was using that charm to rewrite our history. He talked about how he'd sacrificed his own career advancement to support mine, how he'd managed the home front so I could focus on clients, and how he'd been my sounding board and emotional support through every major business decision. He made it sound like he'd been the wind beneath my wings instead of the anchor around my ankle. The most painful part was sitting in those conference rooms, listening to him describe our marriage as if I'd been some sort of slave driver who'd exploited his generous nature. He talked about missed dinners and canceled vacations as if they were evidence of his noble sacrifices rather than the natural growing pains of building a business. He even brought up times when he'd driven me to important meetings when my car was being repaired, making it sound like he'd been my unpaid chauffeur and business assistant. By August, I was at my lowest point. My attorney, while competent, seemed resigned to the fact that Marcus would probably get a significant portion of my assets. California is a community property state, and the business had grown substantially during our marriage. Even though I'd done all the work, the law seemed to favor Marcus's claims. I was looking at potentially losing hundreds of thousands of dollars and having to buy out his share of my own company. That's when I decided to take matters into my own hands. If Marcus wanted to play dirty and rewrite history, I was going to make sure the real history was documented. I started by going through every financial record from our marriage. Bank statements, tax returns, credit card bills, everything. I created a detailed timeline of my business growth and cross-referenced it with our personal expenses and Marcus's actual contributions. What I found was eye-opening. While I'd been building my business, Marcus had been spending our money on increasingly expensive hobbies and purchases, many of which I'd forgotten about or hadn't fully realized the extent of. There were the guitar lessons he'd insisted on for 6 months and then quit. The photography equipment he'd bought claiming he wanted to start a side business but never used. The gym membership at an expensive facility because the regular gym wasn't motivating enough. The subscription services, the gadgets, the clothes. While I was reinvesting every penny back into growing the business, Marcus was treating our joint account like his personal shopping fund. But the real gold mine was in his digital footprint. I hired a forensic accountant, and with court approval, we subpoenaed his social media accounts, text messages, and emails. What we found painted a very different picture than the one his lawyer was presenting. There were messages to friends complaining about my work schedule dating back to 2018, long before my business was really successful. Messages where he called my clients crazy and my work boring. There were texts where he actively discouraged me from taking on bigger projects because it would mean more work for me. Most damning were the messages from 2021 and 2022, where he was actively looking for other jobs and talking about getting out of our marriage, well before his affair started. The social media posts were particularly revealing. While he was claiming in court that he'd sacrificed career opportunities to support my business, his LinkedIn and Facebook showed him regularly posting about work happy hours, long lunches, and weekend golf trips. There were photos of him at concerts and sporting events on weekdays when he'd told me he was networking for his career. It became clear that while I was building a business, he was living like a bachelor with a joint checking account. But the smoking gun came from an unexpected source. Remember the affair I discovered? Well, it turns out Marcus had been more than just emotionally unfaithful. I discovered that he'd been sharing confidential information about my business with his girlfriend, including client lists, financial information, and business strategies. Not only was this a massive breach of trust, but it was also potentially illegal. I found emails where he'd forwarded my client communications to his personal account, ostensibly to help when I was busy. But the timestamps showed he was accessing these emails at odd hours and forwarding them to his girlfriend who worked at a competing consulting firm. They'd been using my proprietary business strategies and client insights for her company's benefit. This was the evidence I needed, but I knew I had to be strategic about how to present it. I couldn't just dump everything on the court at once. I needed to wait for the right moment, when Marcus and his attorney were most confident, most committed to their false narrative. That moment came during the final settlement conference in September. Marcus's lawyer was pushing hard for a 50-50 split of all marital assets, including my business. They'd prepared a presentation showing how Marcus had been integral to my success, complete with charts and timelines that painted him as an unsung hero of my entrepreneurial journey. Marcus himself seemed almost giddy with confidence. During a break in the proceedings, I overheard him on the phone with someone, probably his girlfriend, saying, "It's going better than we expected. Mary's lawyer seems ready to deal." He was already spending money he didn't have yet. When we reconvened, the judge asked if there was any additional evidence either party wanted to present before we moved to final negotiations. That's when I stood up and said, "Your Honor, I have some additional documentation that I believe is relevant to the court's understanding of the marital partnership." I handed the envelope to my attorney, who passed it to the judge. Inside were printed copies of the most damaging text messages, emails, and social media posts, along with a detailed forensic accounting report showing Marcus's actual financial contributions to our household versus his expenditures. But most importantly, it contained evidence of his corporate espionage and the affair timeline. Marcus's face went white as the judge reviewed the documents. His attorney started objecting before he even knew what was in the envelope, but the judge held up his hand for silence. "Mr. Patterson," the judge said, looking at Marcus, "can you explain to the court why you were forwarding your wife's confidential business communications to a third party who works for a competing firm?" The silence in that courtroom was deafening. Marcus started stammering about helping with scheduling and just trying to be supportive, but it was clear he knew he was caught. His attorney asked for a recess to review the documents, and I could see them in heated conversation in the hallway. When they came back, Marcus looked like a man who'd seen his own grave. The judge addressed the court. Based on the evidence presented, it appears that Mr. Patterson not only failed to contribute meaningfully to the growth of Mrs. Patterson's business, but actively undermined it by sharing confidential information with a competitor. Furthermore, the timeline of his extramarital affair and his expressed intentions to end the marriage suggest that his claims of partnership and sacrifice are not credible. But the judge wasn't done. He continued, "The forensic accounting shows a pattern of Mr. Patterson treating marital funds as personal discretionary income, while Mrs. Patterson reinvested in the business that he now claims to have helped build. This court finds that Mr. Patterson's claims to spousal support and equal division of business assets are without merit." The final settlement was nothing like what Marcus had expected. Instead of getting half of everything, he walked away with basically nothing except his personal belongings and half of our joint savings account, which amounted to about $12,000. I kept my business, my house, and my dignity. More importantly, the evidence of corporate espionage meant that Marcus faced potential legal consequences beyond just the divorce. My business attorney filed complaints with his employer and the state licensing board. His girlfriend's company was also notified about the breach of confidentiality, which resulted in both of them losing their jobs. The last I heard, Marcus was working at a much smaller firm for significantly less money, and his girlfriend had moved back to her home state. The man who thought he was going to walk away with hundreds of thousands of dollars ended up unemployed and professionally discredited. The whole experience taught me 3 crucial lessons. First, document everything. I should have been keeping better records of our financial dynamics all along, but I was too trusting and too focused on building my business to notice the patterns. Now I keep meticulous records of all business and personal transactions. Second, trust your instincts. I knew something was off about Marcus's behavior for years, but I kept making excuses and assuming the best. When someone shows you who they are through their actions, believe them the first time. Third, never let anyone rewrite your story. Marcus was incredibly skilled at manipulation and gaslighting, and for months I started questioning my own memories and experiences. But the truth has a way of rising to the surface when you're willing to look for it systematically. Today, my business is thriving more than ever. I've expanded into 3 new markets and hired a team of 12 people. I'm in a relationship with someone who celebrates my success instead of resenting it, and I've never been happier or more financially secure. Sometimes people ask me if I feel bad about how things ended for Marcus. The honest answer is no. He made calculated decisions to betray our marriage, steal from my business, and try to take credit for work he not only didn't do but actively hindered. He gambled on being able to manipulate the legal system and lost because he underestimated my ability to fight back with facts instead of fiction. The envelope I handed to that judge wasn't just evidence of Marcus's deception. It was proof that when someone tries to steal your life's work, the best revenge is simply showing the world who they really are. If you found this story helpful, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life experiences about overcoming betrayal and protecting what you've built.